Hey, welcome back to Slow Bells. I'm in Southport, North Carolina today on my Great Loop Odyssey. Let me show you some pics that I shot from my journey through South Carolina. This is a chart of the Savannah area. Savannah is located here. The Savannah River runs through here, and the Icw crosses the Savannah River into South Carolina here. In my case, I ran up Fields Cut and anchored about here. However, I remember when I passed by this buoy, I was very uncomfortable because I didn't feel like I had a whole lot of room between the buoy and the shallows on the southeastern shoreline. But really, I shouldn't have been such a weenie, because the next morning I watched one of these ships pass by the same buoy at low tide. I wondered whether the navigator in that ship heard a voice in his mind saying something like, "Luke, let go, use the force." As a matter of fact, it turned out that my Anchorage was a pretty good location to watch the ships go by, because from the Anchorage here, I could watch the ships across the marsh go up and down the Savannah River out here. I spent a couple days at the Buford downtown Marina. Buford has got some really impressive old houses that you can walk to from the marina. It also has an unusually nice waterfront area with a park and lots of restaurants to choose from. While I was there, I also walked across the bridge to a Publix store and stocked up on groceries there. A Uber car took me back to the marina. After leaving Buford, I noticed several brush fires burning during the day, which I assumed was some premeditated spring burning program. I stopped short of Watts Cut and anchored in the South Edisto River. Watts Cut is one of those low water areas on the Icw, and I wanted to pass through there the next day at higher water with a rising tide. I got going again the next day after lunch. By then, the tide was flooding with enthusiasm. It's not unusual for the tide and the wind direction to be coming at your boat from opposite directions. What happens is the current expects your boat to point one way, and the wind expects your boat to point the opposite direction, and they get into a big argument about which way the boat should point. Eventually, the boat typically winds up perpendicular to both the current and the wind, arguably the worst of both worlds. But hey, that's the way it is sometimes. When I passed through Watts Cut after lunch, I never saw less than 12.2 feet of water. Waiting for the tide had paid off again. The next cut of interest would be Elliott Cut, just south of Charleston. In the previous year, I had made the mistake of trying to push through there with the current strongly against me. This time I was more careful with my tidal current planning and got through there on a cloudy day with no problems. I normally stop in Charleston because it's such a cool place to visit, but on this trip I did not stop. If you leave Charleston by boat and head towards the Atlantic Ocean, you will pass by this lonely little island, Fort Sumter. North of Charleston, there are some shallow water areas where you need to keep an eye on the depth sounder. There are also non-stop houses and docks for quite some distance, all of them with their own no wake sign. Towards the end of the day, I managed to squeeze past a dredge and slip into an anchorage in Whiteside Creek, where I stayed for 2 nights. When it was quiet enough at night, I could hear the Atlantic surf from my anchorage. I got going again Monday morning, but ran into more shallow water in Matthews Cut, which is a little bit southwest of the town of McClellanville. My buddy Lynn and I had passed through this area with no problems a few months earlier, but once again, the tidal height makes all the difference. When my depth sounder got down to 4.5 feet, I turned around and found a place to anchor until the rising tide worked its magic. I think these birds were taking bets on whether or not I would go aground at anchor, but the tide came in after a few hours, and I passed through Matthews Cut with a whopping 6 feet of water depth. After a couple days of windy weather, I eventually made it to Georgetown, where I stayed for 1 night at the Harbor Walk Marina. Harbor Walk, Slow Bells, 6-8. We're just south of your dock, ready to come in. We have a reservation, and we'd also like to do a pump out and put on a little fuel.
That's right, Captain. If you would, what I'll have you do, if you'll spin around Lake Northside right there in front of my fuel pumps, we can do the fuel and the pump out there. And if I were working with the GFI, we'll just walk you down to the end of the dock after that.
That sounds real good. Thank you.
I'll be out there in the building right now.
In Georgetown, I got in a good walk to the Walmart store for groceries, then took a Uber back to the boat where I had laundry chores to attend to. I was also able to take advantage of a few restaurants to get a break from my usual boat meals. The next stop was in Anchorage next to Oatbed Island, near marker 29, south of Myrtle Beach. It was a nice anchorage, and I spent several days there tinkering with boat chores, editing videos, and listening to the osprey in a tall tree above the anchorage. Purple sandpaper. Now, how cool is that? My last day in South Carolina turned out to be a long day, but a good day. The first challenge was getting through the rock pile. Most of the ICW is made up of generous quantities of mud and sand, but near Myrtle Beach there is an area that had to be blasted out of rock. This section is sometimes called the rock pile, and if you get out of the channel, it is very propeller unfriendly. I intentionally avoided this section until after the weekend, so I was more likely to have the deep water all to myself. The second challenge was finding a marina in the town of Little River. I tried 3 different places and struck out in all 3. I guess my reputation must have preceded me. The third challenge was finding a suitable place to send down the anchor in Calabash Creek, next to the border between South Carolina and North Carolina. Lynn and I had anchored there in November, and it was not the greatest anchorage, although it was okay in quiet, settled weather. I checked it out again after leaving the Little River area, and in my opinion, it was not a safe place to wait out a gale that the weather guessers were talking about in the days to come. The final solution was to continue north to Southport, near the mouth of the Cape Fear River. I arrived there around 6:30 that evening, but it was really a beautiful afternoon of boating on the ICW. While we're looking at all the pretty pictures, I thought I would talk a little about flight planning. Float planning. I often hear that a schedule is the most dangerous thing on a boat. I don't really agree with that, but I would agree that a rigid schedule is one of the most dangerous things on a boat. The reason for this is if you get behind schedule, you can be tempted to do dangerous things to get back on schedule, such as trying to push through a dangerously shallow area at low tide, or maybe traveling after dark on the ICW. Also, keep in mind that the type of float planning that I do is probably going to be different from the type of float planning you do. Over time, you will figure out what works best for you. There are two parts to my float planning: long-range planning and daily planning. The long-range planning is pretty easy. You define a location and a date for the start point and the end point of your trip. Then you divide both the distance and the time into much shorter, equal segments. I use these segments as a reality check, not as a rigid schedule. For example, if I complete a segment early, I know that I can spend a little extra time at my next Marina stop, or I won't have to worry if I have to wait a few days for bad weather to pass through. On the other hand, if I complete a segment a little later than I had planned, I know that I'll need to cruise a little longer each day for the next couple days until I'm roughly back on schedule. Your daily planning is going to be heavily dependent on the tools that you use. And everyone has different planning tools on their boat and on their smartphone and on their computer and in their library. Since my daily planning on the ICW tends to be a little more complicated than some areas like the Chesapeake Bay, I'll talk about my ICW daily planning here. My preference is to run the boat for about 4 or 5 hours a day at roughly 7 knots. So 30-something miles a day would be pretty typical for my trawler. Once I know about where I will end up, I try to identify some kind of stopping point. If it's a marina, a reservation in advance is a good thing, or you might be surprised when you just show up there and ask for a slip. If it's an anchorage, I'll try to pick out one or more possible anchoring spots. Now comes the homework. I get on the waterwayguide.com website, and for my intended route, I'll identify any caution areas listed on the Waterway Guide web pages. I ignore some caution areas in the Waterway Guide, such as missing markers. The items of interest to me are shallow water areas and bridges that need to open before I'm able to pass through. I record each of these caution areas in two places. Number one, I'll make a note using text on my cell phone, such as stay on the red side of the channel when passing buoy number 99. Or for a bridge, I might make a note that says, this bridge only opens at the top of the hour. The other area I record each of these caution areas is on my Garmin chart plotter. I make a waypoint at each caution area. During the day, I always make a temporary straight line route to the next caution area waypoint. I can't follow this straight line route in my boat because it usually cuts right across dry land and shallow water. But this route is still useful because it gives me a pretty good idea when I will reach the next caution area. When the next caution area is less than a mile away, I will usually grab my cell phone and review what I need to do in order to be ready when I reach the caution area. By the way, if the next caution area is a swing bridge that only opens at the top of the hour, the waypoint ETA on my Garmin chart plotter will give me a pretty good idea if I will be early or late for the next opening. I also have a second chart plotter that runs the Navionics app on a tablet computer. Navionics gives me three pieces of information while I'm traveling. Number one, it gives me highly detailed nautical chart data, which is much better than the charts on my Garmin chart plotter. Number two, if I tell Navionics the beginning and end points of my day's run, it will auto-magically generate an impressive route for me to use, which follows all the twists and turns on the ICW and tries to avoid all the shallow water areas. I don't always follow the Navionics route exactly as shown, but I do follow it for most of my day's journey. And number three, throughout the day, Navionics constantly updates the ETA for my day's destination, which is sometimes handy to know. The Navionics app in 2019 is outrageously powerful and ridiculously cheap. In 2019, I think my 1-year subscription was around $20. The charts are excellent, much better than the charts on my Garmin chart plotter. In addition to the charts, Navionics will also supply you with information on stuff like tides, weather, and marinas. For me, it was an excellent investment. On the ICW, I always make a note of the time and the height of high and low tide. On some days, I never look at this information. On other days, it might be very handy to be able to recheck in a few seconds the time and the height of the next high or low tide. Another important item in your daily float planning toolbox will be some way to keep an eye on the weather. The internet and your friendly app store will have a gazillion different ways for you to get a weather forecast, and everyone has their own favorites. Although I flirt with many different weather tools, there are two weather tools I use on a regular basis. Number one is weather.gov. It's just hard to beat this website for weather information. Number two, I also use an app on my smartphone called Windy. With a quick glance, I can see if any strong wind is headed my way in the days ahead. And for me, that's a pretty good roundup of the float planning tools that I use on a regular basis. Well, you now know everything that I know about South Carolina and float planning. Tune in next time when I journey northward through North Carolina. Later.